The DPS passive is possibly the one thing I can pinpoint as my core frustration with Overwatch over the last few years. It ruins the support experience for the most vulnerable casual players, it slows down the DPS experience to the point where the best course of action is often just to wait for stuff to start happening, and it makes the tank experience more about chilling on your infinite well of resources and then hitting the go button when advantaged, rather than ever actually trading with the enemy team. I'm convinced that above everything else, the perks, the water boy, stadium, this is the most important topic in the video game right now. Because the effects of the DPS passive in Season 9 are at once insidious and hard to pin down, and also completely destructive to the average gameplay loop of Overwatch. Healing doesn't put out aggressive pressure anymore. The healing is always net negative on anything you do. Whereas before it was approximately balanced between the two, so you could make a choice. Now you have no choice whatsoever. So now you're getting a lot more DPS support players because, quite frankly, there's nothing else to do. It's just bad to support. It should be okay to generally exist on main and heal the tank, or just heal in general. It should be okay to do that. But now the skill to value scaling is exclusively off of DPSing, and none of the skill to value scaling is based on when or where you do your healing. And therefore, basically, supports have no aggressive pressure output from healing whatsoever, and no skill output from healing whatsoever, or selecting the healing target or choosing the healing timing. So essentially what I'm saying is DPS passive makes support feel awful to play.
Hello guys, it's me, Greed here. I want to talk about the DPS passive in Overwatch. My overall opinion of the DPS passive is that I personally don't like it. I don't think it's good for the game. I don't think it's particularly healthy, and I don't think it solves more problems than it creates. Now, obviously, you have to compromise at some parts. You have to say, well, this system isn't perfect, but perhaps it fixes a couple of big issues and might implement a couple of small issues. But the DPS passive is not one of those. My first complaint with the DPS passive, and I think one that's the easiest to fix in my opinion, though it may create more bloat, is that there's no actual indicator that it's affecting someone. There's no way for you to look at a target and know if the DPS passive is applied on them. You either have to manually see your DPS actively shooting a target and be able to track how long the passive is applied to that hero, or you just kind of have to guess.
I think you can just assume that the DPS passive is active in any fight for the most part, right? Like, I feel like you can just assume it. Where I am at on the DPS passive in terms of positives and negatives is obviously the negatives is completely ruined all scaling in terms of support, damage, and healing. It's made the game worse for DPS, and it's made the game a little bit better for tanks, because at low level tanks have a more consistent experience when they have more stuff, and they guarantee that they're always losing resources when they're active. If they're on a knife edge where they might be gaining, they might be losing depending on the healing, you have to pay a lot more attention to your health bar than you do with a net negative healing solution when it's always going down. You can guarantee that. But then again, I think the trouble with tanks and tank queues is always that it's pinned by the fact that, like, tanks are an audience you have to cultivate over time. They're not something that just turns up instantly. And so changing their experience repeatedly isn't going to help in any way, shape, or form to cultivate a tank audience. You just have a good generic experience. So I think the DPS passive has been a net positive for tanks, and for everyone else, they've been awful, like real bad, right? Supports and DPS have had a horrible offshoot of it because DPS fight other DPS more than DPS fight supports for the most part.
Really think that's a very good system for it. Now, obviously, the argument against adding some kind of indicator would be the skill argument of better players are just going to be able to know these things.
I don't think it realistically matters. Greed ain't a support player. I bet he hadn't played support in a while. Quick click. No, it just feels bad. You never make a decision based off the DPS passive. It just slows down everything you do. The correct decision's mostly always the correct decision regardless.
And also, it might add more visual clutter to the game, which already is quite a hot topic considering the fact there are so many abilities in the game that kind of make seeing a little bit difficult. Something important to note is the DPS passive is actually different in 5v5 and 6v6. Yeah, in 5v5, it's a flat 30% healing reduction on targets affected by the DPS passive, and it's 15% for tanks in 5v5. But for 6v6, it is a flat 15% reduction, I believe. I don't think the tanks get a benefit. So keep in mind that the numbers I'm going to be talking about
The DPS passive, in my mind, is the biggest cop-out on bothering to balance your game in history, because if you currently remove the DPS passive, Overwatch would fall over, because they failed to balance the healing numbers in any way, shape, or form for the last, like, year. It's that bad, right?
Are specific to 6v6 because it's the superior format in every way, and if you disagree, you're simply wrong and a stupid, stinky boy. So, one of the problems with the DPS passive is it affects tank efficacy in terms of their damage output. Now that isn't necessarily a bad thing because the tanks are kind of broken.
They didn't fail, they intentionally unbalanced it to compensate. Yeah, you're right.
Assuming we had a perfect world where the balance was even generally a little bit okay, it can end up affecting tanks in a way that I don't think is really all that healthy. For example, if a tank is going aggressive, let's say a Winston is going aggressive, the difference between a character having the DPS passive on them and not having the DPS passive on them is absolutely gigantic, because Winston does 70 damage per second. Let's assume the target he's going after is being healed by a Mercy. In this scenario, Winston is only doing 10 damage per second to that target, and if you include reload times, I don't believe Winston actually can physically kill any target healed by Mercy. However, if you apply the DPS passive to the target that Winston is hunting, it actually doubles his damage output to 19 instead of 10. Double is still double, no matter how you look at it, which is a big deal. How does it affect other
people? Really don't count for how multiplying things works out, or how, like, if you have a very small number because it's already being mitigated, changing it a little bit can drastically change the outcome. So people are quite bad at thinking about that.
Let's look at Hog, for example. Hog is a tank that actually doesn't really care about the existence of the DPS passive or not, because he does not solely rely on it for his ability to actually kill a target. Because his damage output is extremely bursty, it's irrelevant what the DPS passive is doing, because the chances are he's going to burn through their entire health bar regardless, and it doesn't matter if they're being healed or not, because he can burst them down fast enough. He'll just hook a target, blow them up with peg pen and left click, and there actually isn't enough time for there to be any healing applied to the target anyway, therefore the passive is irrelevant to him. But it completely...
I find it so funny to remember back in the day when they started this complete unilateral balancing via table flipping, where it was the first time at pointing out how differently it affects different characters when you do unilateral changes. Like, sure, we had the DPS passive, which was the reload increase for DPS that was completely crazy when you got a kill. It's just, like, makes no sense whatsoever. Some DPS don't even reload. But after, like, we didn't really have that many conversations about that, because it was like, okay, well, Blizzard are just fumbling, they're just doing stuff, whatever. But then DPS passive came up and we were like, oh, we have to talk about this? Like, does Blizzard not know what they're doing? Why aren't they accounting for all these things, right? Like, why are they doing these sweeping changes and just accidentally nerfing a character by like 10-15% for no reason?
Mutilates a character like Winston's ability to actually go on the backline, because if the DPS passive isn't applied to a certain target, like I said, that cuts his damage in half, assuming he's being healed by a Mercy.
Yeah. And
Mercy outputs relatively middle of the pack levels of healing, though Mercy is a single target healer. Imagine that
it should have been low levels of healing, but they had to repeatedly buff Mercy because they put a DPS passive in.
Winston is going after a target that's being healed by an Alari or a Pylon or a BAP or something. That makes things
Pylon only heals 30 HPS. Get it out of your head that Pylon heals like 100 HPS like it did before. He keeps doing this.
Much
every time we talk about Pylon.
Or if he's hunting a target with armor. It changes so much about the character, and I think overall, the DPS passive inconsistently affecting different tank heroes and support characters overall is not good for the game, because you can lose out on a lot of solo playability purely because maybe your DPS didn't apply the passive onto the target at the right time, or maybe they got hit with a Zarya bubble or a Kiriko cleanse at the right time that actually cleared the passive off them, and that's the difference between you killing a guy and not killing a guy, even if you play well. It comes down to your DPS needing to apply that passive for you in order to get value that you simply cannot get yourself because you don't have the ability to apply the passive.
No, 100%, but look, it means that as tank, you hold space and then play off your DPS's plays instead of the other way around quite a lot of the time.
Now, this obviously affects aggressive tanks than it does more passive. For example, a tank like Reinhardt or Junker Queen get their value while they're committed. Unlike more passive tanks like a Ramatra or a Sigma, where the DPS passive is less relevant because they are incurring less risk from their natural gameplay loop. Their pressure cycle is naturally safer, therefore they have less of a reliance on the DPS passive because they don't need to get their value as quickly play as more aggressive tanks do. For Queen, it's the difference between her killing a target and getting traded out, her killing a target that she's 1v1ing and then staying alive for it, or just simply not being able to kill a target fast enough because they're getting healed. Therefore, it disproportionately affects the tank characters in a negative way, making it so that gameplay becomes more passive overall because it negatively affects aggressive tanks more than it does passive tanks.
100%. Yeah, he's entirely right with that. Well, the point is of the DPS passive, there's no point in healing unless you have to. That's kind of like the point. Healing doesn't put out aggressive pressure anymore because the healing is always net negative on anything you do. It's just disproportionately better to be doing DPS than it is healing. Whereas before it was approximately balanced between the two, so you could make a choice. Now you have no choice whatsoever. So now you're getting a lot more DPS support players because, quite frankly, there's nothing else to do. It's just bad to support. It should be okay to generally exist on main and heal the tank, or just heal in general. It should be okay to do that. There's a lot of people that just disagreed point blank with me on that, and I don't really get where they're coming from. I guess I think they're coming from a place of misunderstanding more than anything. What I mean by that is, if you do not have the DPS passive, where your healing goes matters because you are in potentially a net positive system, in which case you can output pressure with your healing. The moment you end up in a unilaterally net negative system, what happens is it doesn't matter where your healing goes because realistically you're always losing out by doing healing. And that is the same for Zen, that's the same for Mercy, that's the same with Brig, that's the same with Iliari, it's the same with all of the healers. Basically, what you do is you remove all skill component from healing because it just doesn't matter anymore. Okay, so if you remove the skill component, you've made it so that the skill to value scaling of these characters is not the same as it was before. Now the skill to value scaling is exclusively off of DPSing, and none of the skill to value scaling is based on when or where you do your healing. And therefore, basically, supports have no aggressive pressure output from healing whatsoever, and no skill output from healing whatsoever, or selecting the healing target or choosing the healing timing. So essentially what I'm saying is DPS passive makes support feel awful to play, just terrible to play. It makes it feel so much worse, and it targets the people that are least able to look up at a Genji. Right? It targets the people that don't want to have to look up at a Genji. It targets the unspoken masses of casual players that just want to be able to exist inside the universe of Overwatch, right? I think that is bad. I think those players should be able to exist. I think those players should be able to choose smart target for their healing, use their mobility in interesting ways in order to be able to move about and sustain inside the enemy team instead of using a fat, massive health bar in terms of Life Weaver. And then do maybe a little bit of dueling and still be able to more or less climb. I think there is enough skill, and I will say there was enough skill previously to do an unranked to GM on Mercy with only left click prior to Season 9. And probably prior to Overwatch 2 and 6v6. So pre-Season 9 health pool, 6v6, I think Mercy can do an unranked to GM with only left click. I don't think she can do that now. That's the problem.
Now, the DPS passive can actually lead to more bloated healing numbers overall, especially when it comes to AoE healing. Because of a character, say like Baptiste, it may be the case that he's not able to actually heal up a single target through the DPS passive, even though his natural healing output is AoE. Therefore, they might need to buff his overall healing output, or making his overall healing extremely efficient because it's able to target multiple people at the same time, but it may have required a buff because it simply wasn't good enough to keep one target alive through the DPS passive alone, which makes sustain and overall AoE healing infinitely more valuable because the fact that it is naturally going to be lower because it can affect multiple targets. If they were going to buff these supports up to the level where they were actually able to keep a single target alive, they would also be massively increasing the ability for them to sustain the entire team overall, which again is not healthy. Now it comes down to, in my personal opinion, one of the biggest issues with the DPS passive, and it's the application process of it. In order to actually get the DPS passive onto someone, you as a DPS need to apply damage to that character. Think of how it affects the different characters. For Tracer, it's easy. You're just bullet hosing shots absolutely everywhere, and if one of them tags someone, the DPS passive is applied to them. But then you think of a character like Hanzo, and it becomes infinitely harder for that character.
It's just completely non-unilateral. It is for every single case.
To consistently land shots.
The trouble is, do you know what the trouble with this is, right? The trouble with this whole argument from Greed is, it doesn't fucking matter because Blizzard don't care that it's non-unilateral. This is by design, not by accident. They're not forgetting about it. They just don't care, because table flipping guarantees you have a fresh new meta, and a fresh new meta is enough to occupy the children for a little bit of time. right? Exactly the same as I said the other day, right? All you have to do is dump shit into the slop trough often enough and the pigs keep coming. That's just how it works. So what they're doing is they're just rolling the dice, flipping the table, throwing the Lego bricks on the floor. The kids will just make a new house anyway. The house they made wasn't pretty in the first place. Like, the kids will just put it together again. It's not a good way of doing things. It's an awful way of doing things, but it seems to be on purpose, right? It seems to be on purpose. If you have a character like Mercy with limited skill expression, because you don't need to aim or quick reactions like Bap or Anna, you do need quick reactions, but to different things. You don't need quick aim reactions. You do need quick reactions to be able to play Mercy. Then aren't they overtuned if they can get to a GM player's worth of value without damage boost? Yes, of course they're what do you mean? In order to do an unranked to GM, it doesn't imply that you're a GM player. It implies that you're above GM player. That should be pretty obvious, or you've optimized that skill to the point where you can get above GM. I think it's fine for a player to be able to get to GM in concept with only left click on Mercy. Sure, like, you're not using that part of their kit, but that part of their kit is a trade-off with the left click. So realistically, you will be getting more, don't get me wrong, you will be getting more value, but I'm saying that the skill of putting the healing in the correct places should be something that matters on the hero. That's all the argument is. And currently it just doesn't matter in any way, shape or form, right? It just doesn't matter.
Now it comes down to ammo efficiency. This one is a really big deal. Because
I think you're right, Espimo, on his point. Like, it's inconsistent between DPS. But do you think people passively ignore the passive enough to where if Tracer applied it and Hanzo did 3 seconds later, would anyone care? I don't think anyone thinks about it. I think it negatively affects DPS and supports in the way that they can do things. But I think people just always assume that it's on during team fights. And people make their decisions based on that, based on the average lower level of healing and damage they can do. I don't think it's anything else, right? Like, I think that we just assume it's always on. It would take an incredibly high level for anyone to care otherwise. So it does negatively affect some heroes worse than others, but I don't think people play differently because of it. I think supports just assume it's active.
Changes the amount of actual bullets, or really just ammo, required to kill a target depending on who you are and what healing they are. There are a lot of characters in this game where you just simply do not have enough ammo if you maintain a relatively average level of accuracy to cut through the amount of healing a target may receive if they do or don't have the DPS passive on them. If they do have the DPS passive on them, your ammo is extremely efficient because overall it's technically cutting through the same percentage of health, but they are able to regain a smaller portion of that over time from their supports. However, if you do not have the DPS passive applied to the target that you're attacking, your ammo efficiency drops rapidly because it means that the target that you're going for is receiving healing at a much faster rate. Therefore, it takes longer overall because they're receiving healing at the same rate that you're putting out damage, meaning that you're going to have less uptime overall because you're going to have to reload more to cut through their healing.
Yeah, it just creates a very high variance system in an unreadable way. That I don't think people ever externalize, right? I don't think people ever think about it properly, but I do think it affects their experience, right? That's two different things. Being able to put your finger on what's wrong and it affecting your experience is completely different. And I think that so many people are affected by this without knowing that it's a problem. And the moment you see it, it gets very hard to unsee. It gets very hard to unsee because I think quite a lot of people haven't tried no DPS passive in a year and a half. I think it's been a very long time and most people are pretty much used to it and don't really know the difference or what the difference could be.
Therefore, your ammo is less efficient, and this affects a lot of targets. For example, Zarya. The DPS passive existence or non-existent can be the difference between a right-click killing a target and the right-click not killing a target, which means you have to go through a big reload animation, your charge is going to further decay, you're going to be doing less damage over time, and the longer a duel goes on for, you obviously become weaker because of your charge decay and other things. And this obviously applies to a lot of different characters, but it affects Zarya a lot because of the fact that your ammo management on Zarya is so important. Obviously, it's important on basically every character in the game, but it's especially important on Zarya because of the way you weave your right clicks in between your beam. And if you have to end up right clicking someone when you didn't need to, that lowers your beam uptime, which means therefore...
I think it does affect Zarya. a major amount, especially because they have to be so aggressive and they can't really sustain until they want to go. They can't wait and time themselves their DPS. They don't really have a go button. They don't really have speed, so they're affected quite a bit. You really feel it when trying to heal someone with the passives applied to them. Yeah, but who gives a shit about support players, right? There's more of them than the rest of us because the other ones have been made such a worse experience than support, because supports have been made DPS who can support at the same time. So all the support players who wanted to support left the game, and now the only people left are the people that want a DPS but don't want to play the DPSs because the DPS are worse supports. Anyway.
Technically can't cut through a health bar as efficiently, which is a big deal for a Zarya player. Therefore, if you do have a Zarya player on your team and you're a DPS, it's really important that you prioritize the targets she wants to go for, because you increase her ammo efficiency massively. She becomes infinitely more efficient in the damage department if she has the passive applied to her, but she becomes substantially weaker if the passive isn't applied properly onto her target. Now, it's important that I talk about some of the positive aspects of the DPS passive. Now, I don't think any of these are actually good enough justification for the existence of the passive in the first place, but it is important that I touch on the things that are actually good about it. The first thing is it gives DPS a naturally superior dueling advantage when they're fighting targets. Because they're the ones that are able to apply the DPS passive, if they're going to be off dueling someone like a Tracer.
I always find this point comes with a misunderstanding of what DPS do. Every single time somebody says it, I try and get them to explain what a DPS is, and they always get it wrong when people make this point. Maybe Greed's just making it to Steelman, because I think he's heard me explain this before. But DPS are the types of characters that can get into space and therefore protect the damage into places that are unfair for the enemy team to have them, like, pierced into them from. And therefore, due to the peaks and valleys in their output, the very high variance, they are incredibly lethal once they're in their spaces. Supports can't access those spaces, so they don't have those problems. DPS inherently are more lethal in duels than supports are. That's the point. So when you give them a DPS passive that makes them advantaged in duels as well as more lethal in duels, you end up in a situation where they are just strictly better in terms of their damage. I think that the frustration with DPS supports is that there is no burden to heal on supports anymore, due to the fact that they have, well, there's a DPS passive being applied, so I may as well DPS, so they end up in a lot more duels on angles. I don't think it's affected them in a good way, being more powerful in these duels in general. Like, especially when they go up against themselves. Like, it's so, one of the things that DPS really like doing is holding light resources and being given light resources by support in order to go and do something. And that's one of the things that have been most affected by the DPS passive, especially with 5v5 and 30%.
Or a Genji or a soldier, whoever it may be, they're always going to be playing the DPS passive. So no matter what scenario they're in, they're naturally going to be gaining an advantage against their dueling target because, for example, let's say they're dueling a support, they're able to apply the DPS passive to that support, but the support isn't able to apply it to that DPS. Therefore, if, for example, that DPS is a pocket and the support is a pocket, the DPS is naturally going to have a bigger advantage in that duel because of the application of DPS passive, which I think is overall good for the game.
Supports die more often to DPS in neutral if supports by default are not disadvantaged in the fight against DPS. Okay, that was a weird one, so I'll take it a different way. You know cooldowns, right? You know how longer cooldowns make you more passive? In that same, like, counterintuitive way that decreasing a cooldown can actually make it be more used and therefore be less oppressive, making it so supports have a fair duel against DPS on an angle, that they don't outrank them, but they have a fair duel against them, they're not losing, means that supports by default will take more of these fair duels because they are more 50-50, and therefore it leads more openings for the DPS player, because the supports will play more aggressively. So it is in the DPS's favor to not have a default positive duel against the supports. Counterintuitive? Possibly good statement?
Now, Ralph disagrees with this. He thinks that every character in the game should naturally have some kind of 50-50 duel potential.
Yes.
I believe that he doesn't believe that they should all have 50-50 duel potential in the sense that they're able to kill each other 50-50, more so
within the ballpark. I think the outcome of the fight should go, if it's a 1v1 duel, the outcome of the fight should go 50-50 in favor of the DPS or the support. I think that's fair. The support cannot kill the DPS, I'm going to be clear. The supports cannot kill a Tracer unless the Tracer fucks up. The supports cannot kill a Genji unless the Genji fucks up. This is generically true apart from Kiriko, that's probably an outlier because of kunai headshots. That is a statement. right? That's cool, right? DPS play around supports, forcing support resources, potentially assassinating the supports, but they only die if they screw up, and the supports can't chase them in order to kill them if they don't screw up. That's interesting. That's texture. I like that texture. That's part of the game. That's a fun part of the game. I like that.
That maybe a tank is able to out mitigate the damage and survive the 50-50 duel potential, in the sense that they're able to kill each other 50-50, more so that maybe a tank is able to out mitigate the damage and survive the 50-50, or gain more value through the 50-50,
Yep.
even though no kills happen.
Yep.
Or a support is able to sustain themselves through a duel long enough to get more or less value out of it, regardless of who dies.
Yes.
Maybe
DPS should kill, support should win through forcing the DPS space, and then tanks should win against DPS through forcing the DPS's space, and then tanks should win against support through being potentially lethal and forcing cooldowns out of the supports and having complementary damage from the DPS, right? All of the different classes interact with each other, but each of these individual interactions as a net can be 50-50 in terms of their outcome as to whether they're good or bad for each other, and it depends on the context.
that's his point. I don't know entirely. That would make the most sense to me, because it would be a little strange if the argument was that he believes tanks or supports should have a 50-50 chance of killing a DPS target, assuming that the DPS target has gotten them in a 1v1. I would disagree with that, though that might not be what he's saying. Another benefit of the passive is that it helps to cut through a lot of the sustain that I had mentioned was in the game. Now, obviously, a lot of the sustain is in the game partly because of the passive, where a lot of supports have gotten buffed because of the existence of the passive in the first place.
We can change the numbers, yeah.
Assuming that Season 9 stays in the game forever, the DPS passive stays in the game forever, then it is technically a benefit to the game that the DPS passive exists in some degree, because it is...
I think Roadhog is overtuned in 6v6. It's kind of impressive the amount that he can sustain and heal.
Is able to cut through a lot of the sustain in the game. If there wasn't a
He's not
DPS
wrong.
passive, the healing numbers would be way too high. Now, obviously, I don't believe the best solution to the healing numbers being high is to say add the DPS passive. The best way would
Do you know what the best solution to the healing numbers being high is? Making lethal damage that can pierce through the high healing numbers in terms of peaks and valleys more relevant to the fucking video game by reducing the health pools and making it more inconsistent whether it hits. There you go. There you go. There's your solution, right? It all actually worked together on a knife edge, weirdly enough. And when you remove the inconsistent damage that's going to be able to kill through it, you get horrible problems such as people being able to just survive infinitely, which sucks.
simply balance the supports a little bit better and lower their actual healing numbers to something a bit more realistic. But assuming that they never did that and Season 9 stayed and the DPS passive stayed, it would technically be overall a positive for the game, because the DPS would then be able to actually cut through a lot of the sustain, which I think is a big deal, because the sustain...
The DPS do not cut through the sustain by out-damaging the sustain. Where has this come from everyone? The DPS cut through the sustain by f***ing killing someone. That's their job, to kill someone. Not to cut through the sustain, to kill them in 1 second, when sustain doesn't matter. That's it. Unfortunately, Blizzard has decided that Suzu and Lamp have to stay in the game, so that the DPS can get that denied from them. If they get that denied from them, they try and go in for it, they have a problem where they die or they don't do anything for the next 3 hours because the DPS passive making it so they can't be healed back up. So do you know what the DPS do? They go assassinate. They don't do poke from the angle because the DPS passive will get them poked out as well. They just stand there waiting, and they wait and they wait and they wait and they wait. And then the tank goes in and they go, oh, all at once, all at once, all at once. Yeah, no soft pressure. Oh, I hate soft pressure.
right now is a lot, and it is...
Are you saying that the only viable DPS should be ones with really sharp pressure that gets quick kills? No. Yes. No. Yes. All DPS have sharp pressure that gets quick kills. Name me a DPS that does not have sharp pressure that gets quick kills. This is your test here. I'm saying this is a fundamental attribute of DPS that they all have. Moira, that's funny. You've actually proved me right by picking a support that does not have sharp DPS that gets quick kills. See? Support's different than DPS, you see? Yeah, because Moira doesn't actually have sharp DPS. Maybe that's the difference between the categories. Sombra is less quick. Virus, bollocks. Torb, I'm going to overload and I'm going to right-click your face, Espimo, next time you say that. Anyone else? No? Is it actually an attribute of the categorization? It's a definition. Venture? You play against a good venture player, right? Left click, right click, left click melee. Virus is not that sharp. It's just telegraphed. DPS can be telegraphed. Sim, I mean, Sim's a pretty unique DPS that is more outside of the category than any other DPS. I think we'll all admit that. And still, Sim lives off of the nuke bombs, right? Sim lives off the teleport assassination, don't they? Like it's not like we're saying Sim because Sim's such this weird, interesting DPS. We say Sim because they're kind of degenerate and don't do the same things that other DPS because they're so win more. Yeah, I just don't think many people think about this in the way. Sim was originally a support, so being close to the supports is obvious. Yeah, I think supports do pressure in a soft way that forces enemies out of their space by trading resources from them. Tanks do this by trading other people's resources, right? Like by having other people funnel resources into them. DPS have sharp pressure and therefore take resources from other people in a better way. I'd say Farah because she doesn't often play it at a sharp range. Obviously, everything's a spectrum of resources to insta kills, right? Interacting through breakpoints / interacting through sustain / breaking through sustain. I'd say all DPS have some level of interaction on both of these, but I think the thing that matters to the DPS category is definitely the ability to be lethal. Now, in order to be lethal, you need to get that space, which is where the actual system starts rolling, right? And it can be oppressive when you can't get that space and also you aren't lethal, and the enemy team has a lot of sustain but a lot of presence on the map, but that's just you losing the video game, right? That's just you losing the video game because you can't get space and you can't break through sustain. So like that it needs to be, don't get me wrong, it needs to be marked at the door. The sustain can't be high enough to break through and also be the type of characters that are able to control angles, right? D.Va's a real big problem in my opinion because D.Va has enough health that they can always control angles, and D.Va comps can brawl really well, so they have high sustain, especially with Moira type characters. So I think Rhine D.Va or maybe like Ram D.Va at the moment can be really oppressive. Not good, oppressive. It's just different than good. Is Mei designed to be lower because of the wall? Yes. The wall is the pressure. The wall is the sharpness. The wall is the lethality, right? Like, that's the part of the kit that's scary. How am I going to compete with Greed, who's being cogent? God damn it. Like, why is he making sense nowadays?
This is where I watch Ralph react to one of my videos, and he will watch something, he'll listen to what I say, I'll describe it poorly, and he ends up thinking I'm saying something that I'm not, and then we end up disagreeing when in reality...
Yeah, it's easy to happen, isn't it?
We do agree. So I think this format created less ambiguity in the things I'm saying and increased the clarity, so it was a little more obvious.
Greed has to be very careful because he's destroying his brand right now by being fair and even and coherent. His brand is completely insane ramblings that just makes no sense whatsoever. That's the brand, so you got to be careful here.
Be a bit of a child sometimes where I'm like, I'm objectively correct and you're wrong because I know what I'm talking about, and if you disagree, you're silly and you're dumb. And sometimes I don't attack a point objectively and I attack it through emotion, which isn't a very obviously good way to do anything. That's obviously not an excuse. I should be more smart with
Nah, incoherent rambling. You think I come to you for self-improvement, Greed?
If it was clear, I hope you enjoyed it. I love you all. I hope you all have a very good day. Eat a hot meal. Enjoy time with your family. I love you.